Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first edition of the For Women in Science Festival, organized by the Fondation L'Oréal and UNESCO, and broadcast today on 5 continents. My name is Annabelle Mandeng. I am your Master of Ceremony. I have the pleasure to have with me Alexandra Palt, Executive Vice President of the Fondation L'Oréal, and Shamila Nair Bedouel, Assistant Director General for Natural Sciences of UNESCO. Alexandra.
Thank you, Annabelle. It is a great joy to welcome all of you to our For Women in Science Festival. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen how women scientists are essential when needing to respond to existential threats to our health, to society, to the planet. And still, women scientists meet tremendous obstacles in their careers and their research. Even if progress can be noticed, only 33% of researchers worldwide are women, according to the latest UNESCO report. This evolution is still too slow. Important barriers persist, and the glass ceiling remains a reality in research. Women's access to the highest level of responsibility and recognition is still rare. Since the creation of the Nobel Prize in 1901, women represent less than 4% of scientific Nobel Prize winners. The same situation can be seen regarding access to the most cutting-edge areas of research. In artificial intelligence, women make up only 22% of researchers. This is not just a problem for women. This is a problem for research. To be relevant, research has to be inclusive and needs all its talents to be mobilized. This situation is the result of systemic barriers, of unconscious bias, of self-censorship, but also of persistent sexism and discrimination at all stages of women scientists' careers. This is why the Fondation L'Oréal is working with UNESCO to support, promote, and highlight women in science. And with this first edition of the For Women in Science Festival, we also want to celebrate them and to show not only their breakthrough discoveries, but also their resilience.
Indeed, Alexandra, gender equality is at the heart of the mandate of UNESCO. The world needs science, and science needs women. And one way of doing this is to showcase exceptional women. And this is what UNESCO and the Fondation L'Oréal have been doing for the past 23 years. We are committed to showcasing exceptional women in science, to make their work and talent more visible, and to inspire younger generations to pursue scientific careers. Women are not only hesitating to choose a scientific career, they're also leaving science for lack of equal opportunity in the workplace. This is one finding of the UNESCO 2021 Science Report. While the pandemic has demonstrated the ingenuity of women researchers, several studies show that female scientists, particularly those with young children and those in early stages of their careers, are hardest hit by the pandemic. We need to change these trends, and we need to do it urgently. We need the models for women and girl scientists, and we need to put the spotlight on critically important scientific work done by female researchers across the world. 122 laureates, more than 3,800 female doctoral students, postdoctoral students have been supported and honored in 110 countries through the L'Oréal UNESCO for Women in Science program. UNESCO looks forward to carry out our joint work with the Fondation L'Oréal to further promote gender equality in science for current and future generations.
Thank you, Jamila, and thank you, Alexandra. And now, let me tell you what we have in store for you. The agenda for this festival is organized around regions to give voice to the international diversity of women scientists and to welcome you from all over the world. Across the event, you can meet 40+ extraordinary women STEM researchers, discuss their career journeys, and debate what holds women back and how to overcome biases and systematic inequalities. Indeed, resilience is something that these women scientists have in common. They have needed passion, but also courage, patience, and perseverance to stay the course to succeed. After today, you will be able to watch the replay of the festival content and more on this platform, don't hesitate to spread the word and share all these inspirational stories with your friends and families. And get everyone to vote for your favorite talks. Now, let's start right away with 2 inspiring examples of the extraordinary contribution of women to science.
Hello, I am Dr. Bonnie Prado-Pino, and I am an astrodynamicist. Have you ever asked yourself, who owns space? I know I have. Most of us, is it owned by everyone or is it owned by no one? Most of us will be quick to say that space belongs to those who have been actively sending satellites and astronauts up there. Or that it belongs to a specific set of countries just because they have been developing space technology and leading space exploration. Or even that it belongs to the private companies who own the majority of the spacecrafts that are now in orbit. Well, as a matter of fact, if we were all to combine all those theories about who owns space, you get to the idea that space belongs to those who are benefiting from space technologies. But hey, if that is the case, then one thing is for sure. Space belongs to each and every single one of us. And how is that everyone, you might ask? Well, it turns out that with the technology developed from space sciences, people all over the world are able to access internet services. Space truly has the power to connect people's social life through the internet. Granted, of course, that they have access to electricity, to, of course, access the internet, and that they have access to the technological means to be able to enjoy the benefits of the internet. Say, for example, a computer or a cell phone, but that's a discussion for another day. Now, internet access is something that most of us take for granted. Most people do not realize that the services that are possible from space technologies are, for example, the internet. These developments are possible and they are achieved through space technology. Along with the internet, space technologies can now benefit rural communities in some quite unexpected ways. Take, for example, a very rural and isolated region in South America, say Chocó in Colombia, where I'm from. It is a region very rich in biodiversity, both flora and fauna. It is so very beautiful. You can imagine it as a very dense rainforest whose territory is mostly composed of virgin jungles. No wonder why many scientists refer to it as the world's lungs. Now, the inhabitants of these communities in the region, the Chocuano people, would be very affected if these territories, these jungles, were to be impacted, for example, by deforestation. We would also be very devastated by the quantity of research and ancestral knowledge that would be lost on medicinal plants, on both species of flora and fauna. However, the jungle in Chocó could be protected from deforestation if this territory were to be monitored via satellite technology. It would not only be the government that could act to prevent deforestation. We could also train the inhabitants of the region on how to better guard these wonders of nature. This means, though, training the Chocuanos on how to utilize space technologies for their own social and economic growth. To do this, we need to bring them access to electricity, to access the internet, but most important of all, access to education. So, I am a firm believer that While we should continue to bring food as aid to isolated rural territories or communities like those in Choco, we should definitely bring them access to knowledge and access to education and technology. These things will definitely change the game for them. Education is what changed the game for me. And being able to develop new technology that could be accessible for all people, that is what made me interested in space. Now, I invite you to think about this with me. So much of human history has been a story of conquest and dominations. Who owns what? And yes, who owns who? This might be our past, but I am here to tell you that we can definitely prevent it from happening again. Although this time it will be around making a different space history. Whoever controls the resources gets to control the power. And while there are dominant players in space today, human engagement is just forming. We are still in the very early stages of the space history and of the space industry. Currently, only about 95 countries have a presence in space. 95. That is not even half of the countries in our planet. Therefore, it is essential for our space future that every single nation, every single community gets involved in space exploration. That is the only way to guarantee that history is not going to repeat itself. So far as humans know, we are alone in our solar system. We also know that, unfortunately, we will eventually run out of resources on this planet, Earth. This would then force us as a species to look for resources elsewhere, and outer space would be a first option. So just think about this. What is space exploration going to look like at that point? Is it going to be such that whoever gets there first is going to claim that territory as theirs? Are we going to recreate the same social and economic disparities that we are dealing with on Earth right now? Trust me when I tell you, this is not a science fiction movie. This is space sciences, and it is offering us an opportunity to connect many countries to do research cooperatively. For people, all people, we had better make sure that we all get to space one way or another. We better make sure that we all get involved, that each nation gets a piece of that cake. And this is the time to do so. Now, you might ask yourself, how do I get involved? I don't even want to be an engineer. Well, let me tell you something. You do not have to be an engineer to get involved with the space sciences. You could be, a biologist. You could be an accountant. You could be an architect. You could be a medical doctor. Hey, you could even be a farmer. Space sciences are for everyone. Space companies do hire all kinds of different talents. Space sciences, let me repeat myself, are for everyone. So they should be done by everyone. Why? Because space technologies affect each and every single one of us. For us to get involved, we must first identify the need. What is it that I need space technology for? The great news is that we do not have to start from scratch. There are organizations today, such as Leo Labs, where I work, that are working on mapping space traffic, which can be used to identify how and where people can use space technology to improve the situation in their communities. Or, even better, how can people solve their needs if the technology required isn't there yet? As we all get involved with the space industry, we must be accountable for what we do and how we do it in space. Are we sending satellites up there without a plan on what to do with them when they are no longer operational? Are we thinking about pollution? And are we thinking about fair use? Where in space should I place a satellite that can help me with deforestation, for example? What is the purpose of the satellites that are already there? And how can they help my needs? We must connect our actions with our future. Otherwise, we could create an even much bigger problem with the amount of debris generated in space. We could lose access to satellites that monitor the weather, for example. We could lose access to the satellites that can alert us about storms and hurricanes. Or even worse, we could even lose access to the internet. So, much like highways on Earth, we must guarantee that space is safe for all. We must identify the traffic that is already there, and we must be conscious of how to use space technology responsibly. This is the story, and this is history in the making, and you too can be part of it. So, if space technologies can keep us connected, then space technologies can open the doors to many people who, like me, want to make a difference in their community. Cliché, I know, but this is why I do space, and this is why I love space. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Maria Freire. When I was 15 years old, one of my classmates announced that she was going to be a biochemist. Well, I wasn't about to be left behind, so I blurted out, I'm going to be a biophysicist. Now, you can understand I had no idea what that meant. But in school, the nuns had put us, about 100 girls, in 3 tracks, track A, track B, and track C. And it was depending on your abilities. Those in track A knew about mathematics, and we were what you would call the geeks. The girls in tracks B and C were actually the cool girls. But those of us in track A1 had enormous enthusiasm for what we were doing. We had great fun, and we had hoped to have successful careers. Well, as you can imagine, having a career in Peru in the 1970s was not usually the track most women would take. However, 3 graduations later, a wedding, a child, and a continent away, those words that I blurted out so glibly became true. I got my PhD in biophysics from the University of Virginia. Now, it would be gratifying to say that it was all perfectly well planned and executed, but the truth of the matter was that that was not the case. My life has been a series of inflection points, decisions that appeared to be logical, even simple. But those logical and simple decisions made remarkable changes and unexpected consequences in my life. Well, as many of you know, when you're a scientist, the path is relatively clear and well-defined. you get first your doctorate degree and you find postdoctoral fellowships where you hone in your talents and your skills. And this is followed usually by a career either in academia or in industry. And it culminates with the great hope that you will be able to get fabulous funding so that you can do amazing research that will lead to discoveries that will change human history. That's our dream, right? So I was on my second postdoc. I had followed my husband, who was a brand new assistant professor, to his first professorship. My son had been born 3 months earlier, and we settled in fairly nicely. But after 2 years, something was wrong. Something was amiss. Now, I still loved science, and I certainly enjoyed the people I worked with, and the mountains in Tennessee were absolutely fabulous. But I was so unhappy. And it hit me. I just didn't want to be in the lab anymore. And you can imagine, that was heresy. I had been trained to be an assistant professor, then an associate professor, then a full professor. That's what I was supposed to do. So now, what was I going to do with all this knowledge and all this information? How was I going to tap all that I had learned? And that was the real challenge for me. So what I did is I was trying to think of a different way to use my science skills. In a nutshell, how was I going to make all this work? How was I going to make it more relevant to people? Well, life has a very funny way of opening doors in the most unexpected places. Now, in my case, it was in a town called Texarkana. And it's in the border between Texas and Arkansas. I was in a bus going to a scientific meeting when the bus stopped at a gas station. Now, it was a gas station that was in the middle of nowhere, but I went down and I started looking to see what was around, and there was a reading rack. A rinky-dinky reading rack that had some comic books. It had those folded maps that you folded in many different ways. It had 2 or 3 books, and it had some magazines. Of course, at the time, there were no cell phones, there was no Waze, there was certainly no video games. But I decided to pick up the only book that was not about cowboys. And I also picked up a glamour magazine. I read for the 7 hours left in my trip. I was reading this book. It's a book called Having It All by Helen Gurley Brown. I realized that my life was about to change. This is a woman that had taken charge of who she was, of her work, of her sexuality, and most importantly, she had taken charge of her life. And I realized then and there that that's what I needed to do. No more excuses, no more sadness. I was going to take charge of my life, and I was going to write my own story. So when I arrived in San Antonio, I was walking around, and in the convention center, I spotted a homemade pasted flyer in a column, and it said Congressional Science Fellowship. And I thought, I wonder what that's about. That sounds interesting. And of course, by now, I was emboldened with this newfound power, and I decided to apply. What did I have to lose? A few months later, I was in Washington, D.C. And it turned out to be a journey of discovery. It was a transition from being a lab scientist to figuring out how to do science policy. In Washington, I learned how laws were made in the United States. I saw firsthand the dramatic impact that data, when it is well explained, in fact has enormous impact on the way and can change the lives and the understanding of the world. And I also realize the huge benefit of having the systematic, analytical mind that a scientific education provides, especially when you need to make very difficult decisions. The role of science policy is not well understood, and frankly, even less appreciated by many people. Yet, every aspect of our lives and every important decision that needs to be made and recommendations that need to be had have critical effect in the changes of society, and understanding the scientific underpinning of those decisions is absolutely critical. I continued my journey, and one of the things I learned is how to transfer technology from the laboratory to the bedside. Now, for those of you who have never tried to do that, it is a very complicated process. It's fraught with disappointments, but when it works, it is absolutely exhilarating. This led me to head the Office of Technology Transfer at the U.S. National Institutes of Health. The NIH is the largest public biomedical entity in the world, so it was quite an honor. 2 weeks into my job, I get this phone call. Hi, Maria. My name is Frances Collins, and I want to talk to you about the Human Genome Project. Well, right then and there, another unexpected, unplanned, and revolutionary door opened for me. You see, at the time, nobody really knew what sequencing the human genome meant. What were these genes? Who owned them? Could we patent them? Who owned the patents? And so there I was, in the middle of this head-spinning effort by scientists and lawyers and advocates and lawmakers, all working to develop policies and guidelines to what gene patenting and how gene patenting could and would be done. And those policies and patents still have an effect today, not only in the United States, but around the world. Now, it has been many years since I've been in a laboratory, and I can assure you that's a very good thing. I could be very dangerous in a laboratory these days. But even so, biomedical research has remained my passion and has been my guiding light. I have had the honor of recognizing remarkable scientists, women and men, by bestowing the Lasker, the Lurie, and the Trailblazer Prizes. I have been able to enable and support great science, usually in large collaborative projects that have had, and I hope will continue to have, positive impact for the lives of people around the world. And I had the great privilege to be the first CEO of the TB Alliance. It started as a three-person enterprise, and it became a global coalition of scientists, physicians, nurses, and patients all over the world. We produced not only a new tuberculosis drug, but beyond that, a new paradigm for the development of combination therapies. And it is equally a privilege, as president of the foundation of the NIH, a position I just left, to create ACTIV, the Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Innovation and Vaccine Partnership. We launched ACTIV very, very early in the pandemic. It was very early in the year. The days and the nights ran together. Rest was a luxury we did not have. But despite the terrible, terrible toll that this pandemic has taken, the public and private sectors working together, hand in hand, has been a pivotal moment for science and for public health. Well, as scientists, we have the responsibility, indeed the obligation, to educate, to explain, not just to scientists, to inspire them, but to the general public. When science is understood, and most importantly, appreciated and trusted, that's when we will unlock the real potential of science. Now, I wear my scientist hat very proudly. I've worn it in the lab, I have worn it as a policymaker, as an advocate, and I've worn it as a patient. My life has had many ups and downs. It has been and continues to be fabulous, although admittedly not for the faint of heart. I have been, in fact, very, very lucky. And oh, that Glamour magazine? Well, I read that too. And they asked for nominations for 10 outstanding working women. Now, this was 1985, and I figured how many biophysicists could possibly apply. So, to this day, I keep a beautiful Tiffany paperweight on my desk because it reminds me to take risks and to be the one to write my own life history. Thank you very much.
I do believe that women are resilient by nature.
Curiosity, our creativity, and our affinity for collaboration.
I like to think of resilience as strength. And when you find something you love and you do something you love, you will find that strength.
Being away from my family for nearly 10 years.
Female scientists are able to actually move on regardless of the challenges, obstacles.
Be resilient, be strong, be a woman in STEM.
How are women scientists contributing to systems to advance climate resilience? And why is a gender perspective necessary for communities to develop their climate resilience? Important questions that will be answered during our next session dedicated to gender and climate. Grow Women's Leadership.
Hello, my name is Adam Badawi and I'm the Deputy Global Editorial Director for GQ, and it's my privilege to be your moderator for this session. Today's panel is titled Gender and Climate, Grow Women's Leadership. People increasingly recognize that climate change is a great existential threat both to humans and to our planet. But what is less understood and less frequently discussed is that extreme weather and other climate impacts are also gender problems that disproportionately affect women. Today, we're going to explore the intersectionality of the challenges we collectively face, both in climate change and in gender inequality. Why and how are women more vulnerable to the effects of climate change? And how can we counter environmental injustice and enable even more women to become leaders for climate action in their communities, countries, and regions? We have the immense privilege today of being joined by a diverse set of female leaders whose ambitious and thoughtful and innovative work has intersected with this space of gender and climate. They are scientists, they are advocates, they are policymakers, and they are uniquely shaping this important conversation. Though their fields of practice differ widely, we're going to discover the threads that connect these leaders. We'll learn from them what the next steps are in empowering more female leaders in climate decision-making. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Her Excellency Professor Judy Wakhungu, Ambassador of Kenya to the French Republic, Portugal, Serbia, and Holy See, and the former Kenyan Cabinet Secretary for Environment and Natural Resources. Dr. Emily Choi, a postdoctoral fellow at the Natural Resource Sciences at McGill University. Dr. Sita Coleman-Kamala, President for the Center of PFAS Solutions. Nazreen El-Saim, Chair of the UN Secretary-General Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, and Professor Catherine Ngila, the Acting Executive Director for the African Academy of Sciences. Let's begin zooming in on the major challenges that climate change is creating for the women that you've all been working with. Judy, we'll start with you. I mean, you're very, very familiar with this nexus of climate change and gender inequality. You hosted a UNEP conference on gender and the environment in 2014.
Yes.
How have you seen this relationship between climate and gender evolve? And what role are you playing now to really tackle those challenges?
Well, we live in a gendered world, and I think we all know that. We live in a gendered world. From my perspective, which is mostly distinctly African, I would say it even differs from culture to culture, ethnicity to ethnicity, in terms of just how we live in a gendered world. Climate change and the vagaries of climate have affected all of us, both men and women. But when I look with my broadly cultural lens, I say that women are disproportionately affected. For most of Afro-Africans, when we look at the food that we eat, 70% to 80% of the food that we eat is produced by women. Our agriculture is rain-fed. We are now going through cycles where we're going through cycles of flooding, through cycles of extensive drought. And women are the mothers. Women are the people that are supposed to feed their families. Women are in charge of food security. And this is women, whether they're agriculturists or whether they are living in pastoral communities. So the pressure on women to provide food and just enhance their families' livelihoods is truly under a lot of pressure. Let us also not forget that when we produce food, we are relying on the land. Women don't have land rights. We are trying to improve land tenure systems so that women have land rights, but it's improving slowly, but it's a bit too slow for some of us to deal with some of the realities that we deal with. It's a tough struggle, but also we are working, say, with agriculturalists to provide a climate-smart agriculture. Women, of course, are the knowledge holders of our indigenous seeds, which we know during the vagaries of weather fare better than, say, the modern agricultural seeds that are provided. So it's just to give you an example of the fact that we live in a gendered world. It is not equal. Different communities, even in our own country, are being affected differently. But overall, when it comes to what the national government is trying to do, we're trying to provide more access to women in order to have a more equitable society.
So many interesting intersections you touched upon there, whether they're economic, agricultural, and also in community leadership that we see from a lot of women. Leadership that is often uncredited or unofficial, but nonetheless extremely real. Emily, your studies of beluga in the Arctic have allowed you to connect with some indigenous communities as well, and those communities have been disproportionately led by women. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your research revealed to you in terms of both climate and gender?
First of all, the Arctic is warming at such a rapid rate. Climate change is just heavily impacting the communities in the north. So again, the Arctic is changing very, very rapidly, and the northern communities are feeling the impacts. And what I've found from working with these communities, they're very concerned with the welfare of their whales. They're an important traditional food. And there's really an issue with food security with the impacts of climate change on these whales. So, for example, beluga meat is extremely nutritious. It's very high in vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D, as well as omega-3 fatty acids. And there are many studies that have shown that traditional foods, such as beluga maktak, are much more nutritious than store-bought foods, which are often expired by the time they reach the north and extremely expensive. So climate change is impacting some of these traditional harvests, which are very important to the communities in the north. Again, for example, while I was working as a scientist with these communities, they had been telling the scientists for years that the whales were getting smaller, and then within a few years, one of the scientists from Fisheries and Oceans that showed that the beluga whales were declining in growth rates over a 20-year period. So again, the effects of climate change are heavily impacting. But I found that working as part of these programs, there's strong involvement of, again, as we mentioned, female leaders, all of the youth. So I've worked with Indigenous youth. All the assistants that I've had have been women. I've worked a lot with elders who have, again, shared their knowledge with me on the impacts of climate change in the north. And so they've been very heavily involved with these research programs. And, as long as there's opportunities, I think that women have been taking a leadership role in the monitoring programs to look at climate change on these traditional harvests and predators.
Sitha, I know you have a very deep passion for female leadership, and I'd love for you to share a little bit more about why female leadership is just so urgent in these decision-making processes around climate, and just how absent they've been at their highest levels.
Wow. I'd like to answer that, I think, at two levels. One is, leaders, women leaders, and then women leadership. To me, leadership is not just a domain for leaders, right? When I go, wherever we've been, my husband and I have been working with, specifically in waste and waste management and plastics waste in India. Almost all of that, virtually all of that at the ground level, day-to-day, street level is done by women.
Yeah.
Women who, they're basically called rag pickers. I mean, in the informal sector, you call it what? They just work day and night to sweep and clean, and it gets turned over, and, people pick the most valuable stuff, and they're picking again, they're sweeping the streets. And, organizing that work is also done by women NGOs. And we worked with one in Bangalore called Sahas. Wilma Rodriguez, I think she was a tremendous leader. I'd like to call out, you can go look at our website, Sahas. But she realized that in order to make it work for the housewives, because those are the ones who are actually bringing out the trash, putting it out on the street, and the maids who are bringing it out, she really has to go and teach them how to separate out, the potato peels from the plastic waste. Ground up, she's done a tremendous job, bringing back also some of the older, technologies or the tricks that we knew, that is that, if you just sprinkle some cow urine on just compostables, they degrade faster and they become very rich. So she did what I call was a totally integrated bottom-up approach to waste management, keeping the streets clean. And her challenge is further down in the value chain, as I call the value chain of the recyclables, are all men, right? And they actually get the cream of the money.
Yeah.
So there's actually if you look at the economics of the recycling or waste management, most of it doesn't reach the people who are actually doing that work. And the whole recyclables markets go up and down, and they're really the victims of this, right? And then there's a whole change in technology and street sweeping coming up. So I think women's leadership in that particular regard was tremendously important, because women are the ones dealing with the day-to-day of keeping the house clean, keeping their neighborhoods clean, keeping it clean from, vermin and rats and whatnot. And the organizers are women, and the people who are doing the work are women. And this is true also in some of the other developed countries. So that is at the waste level, and then at the climate level, of course, all the ones who are rattling the cages are all women. And I think Pew Research showed that women in general, I think it was some percentage, feel climate change as a more urgent crisis than a majority of the men that were polled.
Yes.
Well, Nazreen, you're 26 years old, and I think you're a prime example of a future leader, although it's very easy to argue that you're currently a leader in your day-to-day life right now. But you talked about how you're existing as an intermediary between these two very different worlds, and how have you found that process?
Yeah, first of all, before I answer your question, I have a question for Judy. What is the average number of cows
In Kenya?
for the brides?
For the brides. Depending on where you are in the community, I would say cows maybe 90, camels maybe 40, goats maybe 200.
Yes. So in many communities, females get traded by cows, camels, and other kind of cattle, actually. And the value where you are, you get more cows and more camels that you will not see any of them because it will go to your father or your brother or the person who's actually responsible for you. And this is not only a policy issue, but it's also a cultural issue. But the different situations we are living in every day just assured us that the policies that the country takes change the culture. For example, she banned plastic, single-use plastic in Kenya in 2017. And now I don't think Kenyans remember how they were using single-use plastic. This is a very sad example, but I need to set it. So in Sudan, we had a very progressive country. We had the first women in parliament in the 60s. We had equal payment from the 70s. We had maternity leave from the 50s. We had women driving cars from the 50s too. I mean, all of the rights of the women were perfect until we had a government that thought that these are wrong. And now we are fighting for the very basic rights of females after more than 70 years of progressive actions towards females. Sometimes, unfortunately, but sometimes it's fortunate when we have good leaders that understand how complex it is. They can actually influence bigger number. They can influence more, and they have the rule of law, which is something that scientists doesn't have, unfortunately. They are there anyway. So we have to educate them. We have to make them aware at least of the priorities and the top priorities of the issues that we are facing in the grassroots, in the bottom level, so they can actually reflect that on their policies on the national level, but also in the international level. I think every woman that in Sudan that actually walks 4 kilometers a day to access clean water for their family is a woman leader, because it's a long walk I cannot do as a city girl. Every woman actually have to make sure that someone will come to her house to help her deliver the baby. For me, is a woman leader, because we have hundreds of babies delivered in Sudan every day, but no one knows what circumstances are these babies going to deliver in. I think females who actually suffer to cook food for their families every day because they are just inhalating all of these vibes coming out of the burning wood or the burning charcoal are leaders, because they die at the age of 30, maximum the age of 35, because they will have lungs problem. And I think all of this unseen leadership, all of this privilege that we all take for granted is really, really back to, are we really solidating with other women who have other circumstances? Are we as scientists really supporting these females? And if we are supporting these women, how much are we helping their problems and their issues? And how much influence we can have on our politicians, our policymakers and decision makers to actually help them in their life? I mean, climate change is a matter of priority, and for me, our communities who suffers the most but contribute less to climate change, females who are by far more impacted than other population, and the young kids who are actually suffering to have a future in the future. And I think all of us here in the room, scientists, policymakers, males, females, need to push more for climate action, because we don't have any other option. It's this or dying, all of us.
What you hit on, Nazreen, especially regarding this notion, this fact that the people that are contributing the least to climate change are disproportionately suffering the most, really hits at the injustice that's present here and the need for more leadership around this topic. Catherine, you won the L'Oreal Award earlier this year for your contributions to sustainable water management. I'd really love to know your thoughts about how climate and gender issues have intersected in your work.
No, thank you very much, Adam, again, and also thanks, Nasrin. Quite exciting to hear some of the issues that are really real issues that are impacting on societies, particularly more to do with women. In my research area, and also for the award, the Laureate Award, I won the award because of water research management, in particular looking at how to monitor water, coming up with technologies that can be able to identify or establish if water is clean and is also suitable for drinking. This is more so important because when you look at, you can look at societies. We've got access to water. But the question is, how clean is that water for drinking? And also when I look back, as I was growing up in the rural areas, I remember we used to go to the dams, we go and swim, and after we have swum in the same water body, we go and fetch the same water to drink. So looking back, and I'm just wondering, how did I survive all those years? Because really, that was really, it is really terrible to be able to be exposed to that kind of situation. So for me, when I look back in the rural areas, I'm asking myself, I see communities are drinking water. This is borehole water. They have dug underground water. People are just interested in, digging these boreholes just so that they can be able to get water. But my biggest question is, how good is this water for drinking? So these are some of my, issues, and I grapple with these issues as an analytical chemist, as a water research scientist. I'm always so disappointed that we do not have facilities, good infrastructure, to invest in, in societies, in universities, in institutions, so that we can be able to have research, correct research, and we can be able to see what is happening. We can make use of research for evidence-based so that we can be able to solve problems, societal problems. In my research, when we developed nanotechnology materials, I was saying that the ability to be able to commercialize these materials, you can be able to use these materials as cartridges in societies, in rural areas, so that every single woman in their rural home, they should be able to have the ability to filter water so that they are assured of the clean water. Yes. So this is my dream, to be able to have a system that is bounded in each one of these villages in the rural society so that they can be able to clean water for their domestic consumption.
What I loved about that round of conversation was just how much each of you are pushing towards action.
Yep.
Right, and pushing towards, pushing past this paradigm to a much better one, and the urgency behind that. So I know for a fact that no one on this panel is interested in navel gazing, sitting here and talking without any solutions. So we all have a collective desire for action on climate and gender inequality. Let's talk about solutions. I'm going to ask each of you to give short, sharp answers, really decisive key messages around solutions for this. Let's keep it short because I do want to keep time, if possible, for a few audience questions. Emily, what is a solution you might encourage to help female leaders in the Indigenous communities you've seen?
Well, I think it's so important for not only policymakers, but for scientists such as myself to work with communities in the North. Again, I found that my program was one of the few community-based monitoring programs study the effects of climate change on predators, and it was so important, in terms of Indigenous traditional knowledge, to listen to the communities. And again, it's so important for women to be leaders within these programs. I worked on traditional foods. Women prepare the foods, and they are enthusiastic and eager to be engaged. From the youth to the elders, and so it's so important for scientists to work with communities, but also to engage women within these communities as leaders.
Judy, can we, or rather, how can we insist that national governments adopt more inclusive climate policies?
Well, I think I have proven my case by enacting laws, which was very hard. I think I missed out one law, which was also the Water Act, which I enacted in 2016. 2016, I also enacted the Climate Change Act. I was the lead author and the lead strategist going into all the COPs, from COP21 up to Now I'm sort of in the background, but I'm still making noise. Going to Glasgow, we must address issues of loss and damage. If we don't address issues of loss and damage, I mean, you have heard what the esteemed panelists have said about women's position. Loss and damage has to be addressed. The issue of climate financing has to be addressed. Even now, governments are dithering, in terms of the big emitters, are dithering as to when are they going to make their contribution when it comes to the 100 billion US dollars that was promised here in Paris in 2015. So some of us are calculating, even though we're not mathematicians, we're saying that in 2021 it's $600 billion. You know, that's what we want to address.
Catherine, what point of focus do you think should be a priority right now to address gender inequality and climate change?
I thank you again, Adam, and also thank you to Judy for those very insightful ideas. For me, I feel that when you look at the three areas that we need to focus on, which is risk management in climate change or mitigation for climate change, and so adaptation methods and mitigation, women must be involved in decision making. Almost, going towards the rural areas, we have got women groups, and so these women groups need to be trained on various ways of tackling climate change, whether it is in agriculture, whether it is in water, whether it is in energy, and so forth and so on, so that they can be able to have optimized and also better ways in which they can deal with some of these issues of water, food, health, and also energy. Capacity building, like I said, is very, very important. And also, they must be involved in, climate financing. They must be able to be allocated funding to tackle some of the issues that are really affecting them, on the ground.
Thank you, Catherine. Nazreen, I know you are extremely passionate about taking action and not just talking about taking action. What do you think about the current urgency level of major political leaders when it comes to the climate?
Well, they need to be changed. and because unfortunately the issue that we are having right now with the political leaders are not that they don't understand. They understand very well. Yet they don't have the will nor the power to actually get out of this, let me say, the evil triangle of influence, interest, and financial flow. And if you are not able as a leader to actually set the priorities of the people that you are actually leading, then you are not a leader, simply. We vote for leaders, right? And it's our turn right now, as also as a citizen, not only as world leaders, to say that, well, it's so simple. I'm not giving my voice, my vote to anyone who doesn't really care about me or my future generation or my kids. I'm not giving my voice to anyone who doesn't care if we are roasted or drowned under the water or anything happened to us just to stay in power. I'm not giving my voice to someone that doesn't care about the future of the Earth in the first place, and instead of they are investing more in going to Moon or Mars or whatever. I think the biggest issue, even with the world leaders that we have today, is they lost this communication with people. And sometimes, and I think this is the sometimes that we all say, sometimes, this is the sometimes, radical actions is the only way that we can survive, and radical action is the only way we can actually take things forward. Having said that, there are some good practices happening. We need to highlight these good practices. Right. And we need to have more women in the national level so they can go up to the international level.
Absolutely.
So a change from inside the country needs to happen before us talking about the multilateral era and the multilateral situation and level. So there's a lot of work to do, not only to change the world leaders, but also to make a case that world leaders are leading us. So if you don't want to lead us to our interests, then you are not leading us. You're just surviving yourself in your chair. And by making this very clear, I think their chairs will shake and they will start touching the chairs like, okay, now I can do things the right way. And I think this is what we can do, and this is what we are doing right now.
Let the chairs shake. Sita, what solution do you think should be a priority right now?
I think your question, I was going to question your question, which is the national governments. I don't think national governments can be a solution to climate problems. I really think that we have to go back to hyper-local solutions, which is where the connections to women and women's wisdom, as we're talking about, comes in. When you look at water harvesting, it's really all about, catching the water in catchment areas.
Yeah.
It works best. Women used to collect in India. There was a whole wisdom on, rainwater harvesting. That was all hyper-local. So there was a feedback loop to supply and demand, how much water there was. They corrected the demand and the use. So none of this about centrally produced. Nobody knows how much is produced and we overuse. So you really have to go back, I think, to hyper-local solutions, also for energy. If you look at what happens with solar, if you have a solar panel in your house, you're constantly looking to see how much power is going because it's now, it's now produced by you. Yeah. Right? And then you're actually selling it back to the grid. So it's changing your consumption patterns if you go back to a hyperlocal production of energy and water. Mm-hmm. And that then brings it back to women, to me. They will be in control. They won't produce excess. They won't consume excess.
Yes.
I think we have to go back to those kind of solutions. All these national solutions have delays, wastage. A lot of money is wasted by the time the money comes flowing down to the ground. So I would challenge your question. I think stop thinking about national government policies. They ain't going to save us. Full stop.
Macro and micro working together. That's just about all that we have time for today, and I hope you'll all agree, for those in our audience and those watching at home, that this was a compelling and urgent and very much an inspiring discussion. To our panelists, I'm so grateful to each of you for your contributions as well as for your continued leadership. Thank you. Audience members, please join me in thanking our phenomenal panelists, Her Excellency Professor Judy Wakungu, Dr. Emily Choi, Dr. Sita Coleman-Kamala, Nazreen Alsaim, and Professor Catherine Ngila. Thank you so very much. Appreciate you. Thank you.
Just persevere and keep on going in your direction that you like. Find something that you like and stick to it and be the best at it.
Faire un métier qu'on aime. Et ce que je voulais, c'était des challenges, oser, agir, dépasser les barrières.
Resilience is certainly something that women in science need. I think science is a very challenging culture.
Significa hacer de la ciencia una forma de vida.
Standing up for those who are voiceless, who are trampled on, who are dispossessed.
Really never give up.
I hope you enjoyed listening to those fantastic speakers on women and environmental leadership and the importance of empowering women in the fight against climate change. Next up are Dr. Lisa Mosconi, who studies gender and the brain, and Professor Joanna Bryson, who will speak on governing artificial intelligence to counter implicit bias.
Dr. Mosconi, thank you so much for joining me. As director of the Weill Cornell Women's Brain Initiative and the Alzheimer's Prevention Clinic, you sit at such an interesting intersection between neuroscience and women's health.
Yes.
And your new book, The XX Brain, is full of startling statistics. 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients in the US are women.
That's right.
At age 45, a woman has a 1 in 5 chance of developing Alzheimer's, and a man at the same age faces a 1 in 10 chance. And after the age of 60, a woman is more likely to develop Alzheimer's than breast cancer. So here's the million-dollar question.
Yes.
What's going on? Why is this happening to women?
When I started, most people were just not interested in even looking into this question. And for me, it's really personal. I have a family history of Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia on the planet. For me, for my family, my grandmother had Alzheimer's disease, which was very scary and very frightening back then. And a few years later, her 2 sisters also developed Alzheimer's disease, whereas their brother was spared. So that was quite upsetting obviously for my family, but for me as a scientist, I had just started my PhD. And my question was, is it just me? Is it just my family? Or is there something more to be learned about Alzheimer's disease and its effects on women? Today, almost 2/3 of all Alzheimer's patients are women, not just in the United States, also in Europe and the most industrialized countries that we have statistics for, which really means that for every man suffering from Alzheimer's disease, there are 2 women. And for a really long time, people would say, well, what happens is that women live longer than men, and Alzheimer's disease is a disease of old age. And so it's just inevitable that more women end up with Alzheimer's disease. And there was something that just didn't add up. And if you think about it, women don't live that much longer than men. In the United States, the difference is 4.5 years. In other countries, like in England, the gap is just 2 years. And then even most importantly, I think even more importantly than that, has been research showing that Alzheimer's is actually not a disease of old age. It starts with negative changes in the brain years, if not decades, before clinical symptoms emerge. And that changes your entire question, because then the question is not, why do women get Alzheimer's more than men? The question becomes, what happens to women and not to men in midlife that could potentially trigger Alzheimer's disease in women, or could potentially explain the higher risk of Alzheimer's, the higher prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in women. There's quite a connection between menopause and Alzheimer's disease, because menopause happens in midlife. Usually the average age is 51 to 52 years in the United States, and in many other countries it ranges 51 to 53. But something that most people don't realize is that menopause also really strongly impacts the brain.
So there are neurological symptoms to menopause.
Yes, so if you think about it, as a society, we think of menopause as something that affects the ovaries.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. There's something obviously that's changing in your ovarian function, in your period, in your fertility. So it makes sense to make the connection. But if you think of the actual symptoms that are so disruptive for women, the hot flashes, the night sweats, insomnia, anxiety, depression, brain fog is a huge problem for so many women, especially at work, even memory lapses. Those symptoms don't start in the ovaries. Those symptoms start in the brain.
Why do you think there's this lack of connection or this cultural understanding?
I think there's a lot to be said about the history of science and how science and medicine broadly let women down. And there's one defining moment back in the 1960s when a drug called thalidomide was given to many women, including pregnant women, to prevent nausea. And later on, it turned out that the drug had a catastrophic effect on the fetuses, and many children were born with very severe disabilities. And that prompted the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, to exclude all women of childbearing potential from clinical trials. So we have all this research from back then with no women in it. And that was considered normal because there's this general bias in medicine to consider men and women as being essentially the same person, just with different reproductive organs, which I refer to as bikini medicine, which is now a popular term. So women's health, the whole field of women's health was really developed based on this framework that is in turn based on a very reductive understanding of what a woman is to start with. And so medications may not apply to women. The diagnostic criteria may just not apply to women. So
it's a neurological study, never considered the difference between men and women historically.
I would say very few studies. So there is something that is quite scary. There's a whole field of neurology, I would say neuroscience, that looked at women's brains, but their goal was to show that women's brains were inferior. That's not so much the case in my field, at least not recently, whereas we're looking at the other side of the coin, where people just don't care about women's brains. And that is very problematic for us because we know that there are some brain diseases that affect more women than men. And there are brain diseases that affect more men than women, right? But women have not been studied. Women's brain health remains one of the most under-researched, underfunded fields of medicine.
Right.
Women are more likely than men to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder or depression. We're 3 times more likely to develop an autoimmune disorder, including those that attack the brain, like multiple sclerosis. We're 4 times more likely to suffer from migraines and headaches, as any woman knows.
Yeah.
We're also more likely to develop some brain tumors and to die of a stroke. And on top of that, Alzheimer's disease affects more women than men. So we really need to look into this.
Right. So you gave a TED Talk in
did.
December 2019.
That's right.
And you brought up this really scary brain scan, I might
Yes.
say, right? Before menopause, brain energy for a woman is really high. Post-menopause, that energy level drops.
Yeah.
Right.
During the transition.
Right. What's going on there?
What we have shown by doing brain scans over time is that if you look at a woman, with the brain of a woman using brain imaging techniques, this brain, or on average, the brain of a premenopausal woman is very bright. You can see a lot of metabolic activity. But then brain energy levels tend to decline as the person goes from premenopause to postmenopause.
Wow.
And sometimes there's quite a bit of a drop. That's an average of 25 to 30%, at least in our studies.
Right.
There's quite a bit of change, quite a bit of drop in the way that the brain metabolizes glucose, a simple sugar, to make energy. And this change tends to correlate with some of the symptoms of menopause, like the fatigue, the exhaustion, the brain fog.
I see.
The reduced concentration, the
So,
memory.
to clarify, this reduced metabolism has nothing to do with intelligence.
What I think is really important about this research is that forever, women in menopause were basically made to feel like they were going nuts.
Yeah.
So I think it's so important to have a brain scan, an image that really validates what women have been saying for centuries. Right? So you know that your brain is indeed changing. And what's really important to say is that these changes are physiological. They do not reflect on your intellectual capability and not even on your cognitive performance. So this is something that I really want to underline. You know, this is just one thing that's changing in the brain. It doesn't mean that your cognitive capabilities are changing. They're 2 different things. So that's very important. Their cognitive performance is broadly unchanged as they go through menopause. And a ton of other studies have shown that as well. That sometimes there's a tiny little bit of a dip during the perimenopausal years, which is when you're not sleeping at night, right? Which is when you're having the hot flashes, which is when you're having a hard time for some women.
Yeah.
But then cognitive performance rebounds.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that there are never differences in cognitive performance between men and women.
I see.
In that age range. And actually, women tend to outperform men on cognitive testing before and after menopause. So a woman who's having the hot flashes and night sweats, she hasn't slept at night, she has a hard time concentration, she's still performing better than a man who's not going through menopause.
So is it all bad news for women who are about to hit menopause? You know, their brain is falling apart, or sort of, it's not falling apart.
No, it's not. Well, that's the
Yes.
good thing. It's not falling apart.
Their brain
so
is-
the brain is changing.
Yeah.
And what I think is really important to underline is that when we talk about changes, there's a tendency to kind of humanize the findings and just use these better or worse connotations that just do not reflect biology. Right? So we can't conclude that a change is necessarily a worsening, not from our data. A change is a change, something is changing. And it's really, I think the bottom line is that the studies show that the female brain has the under-celebrated ability to adapt to menopause. the ovaries are kind of shutting down. That's what people say, your ovaries shut down, which is not exactly true. The ovaries just stop making estradiol, but the brain carries on. And it's really important, I think, to understand how this is possible, why this is happening, what are the consequences of that, and also to contextualize menopause as a normal physiological event. It's not an alien event. There are precedents. There's puberty, there's pregnancy, there's menopause. They're very similar from the brain's perspective. But society depicts menopause as being a catastrophe.
Right.
And so everybody's looking for something that goes wrong with menopause.
Right.
And we wanted to look at the upside.
It's
There is
always the
one.
butt of jokes, right? A woman who's hitting menopause is, you know, sort of sidelined.
But I think there's a stigma around menopause, but we know that there's ageism, there's sexism, and there's menopauseism. And I really hope that more and more science that looks at menopause in a very rigorous, valid way will help break the taboos and really will help women feel more comfortable talking about menopause.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
I think that's a nice note to end on. Dr. Mosconi, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for being here.
Hi, I'm Joanna Bryson. This event is a celebration of women in science. I want to show you how I moved from science through ethics to governance, and how I have been using science throughout that entire journey. And I am currently using science to help people govern. My original goal was to understand intelligence, and I chose to do that through building artificial intelligence models of natural intelligence. As it happened, part of my path on that journey took me through MIT. And there, believe it or not, I was supposed to make this pile of motors and wires into the intellectual equivalent of a 2-year-old child. I say pile of motors and wires without prejudice. When I worked on this robot, and when this picture was taken, actually, it didn't work at all. Yet, I would have people walking up to me and saying to me, it would be unethical to unplug that robot. And I said, it's not plugged in. And they said, well, if you plug it in. And I was really confused. I said, but it doesn't work. And they said, well, you know, if it works. And I said, what are you actually saying? And they'd say, look, what we've learned, and they're proud to know this, what we've learned from feminism and the civil rights movement is that we need to be generous in our understanding of what it is to be a human. And I thought, if what you learned from feminism is that a bunch of motors and wires, and let me show you this. There were lots of other robots. This is MIT. They worked, right? They didn't say this about these robots. So if you have a bunch of motors and wires, and it looks sort of like a person, then it's as much like a man as a woman is like a man. Feminism is not done yet, all right? So eventually, I should say that this robot did behave beautifully. Well, for example, it could play the drums. But it never actually became a 2-year-old. Anyway, I wrote a bunch of papers about this entire experience. My first artificial intelligence ethics paper was called Just Another Artifact, to try to get the idea that it's not a person. And then, that paper came out in 1998. I was one of the very few people who had been writing AI ethics papers since the 1990s. So because of that, since about 2010, I've frequently been invited to the table when people realized that AI is something that's affecting society. And when I got those invitations, even though it wasn't what I normally did, I leaned in, even before I read the book. So now I'm going to show you an example of some of my most recent work instead of my really old work, right? Okay, so this is not my work. This is actually an example of misinformation that helped inspire my work. And so there's so many problems with this slide. One thing is that it assumes that everyone that's East Asian is working together. Actually, let me tell you what the slide is. It's trying to say something about who actually has a hope of controlling artificial intelligence, and it's looking at only the largest companies, right? So there's a lot of slides like this. So not only is this slide confounding all of Asia as if it was the same kind of thing, like the EU, but also it's assuming that being a large company is a good thing. However, since the 19th century, governments have known that too much market power in one company is actually a bad thing and can disrupt both economies and also governments. So last year, a colleague and I actually asked, what happens if we look not at market capitalization as what should be included on this slide, but what about looking at innovation? Okay, so let's start from innovation and then see what market capitalization shows us. Okay, so what you can see here is on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you're seeing the number of patents that these companies had that were filed in the WIPO, the global database of patents, just for one subset of things that was pretty much a good chunk of artificial intelligence. So this isn't all the AI patents, but nevertheless, and notice that it's log. This is a log-log scale. I hope you're all used to that now, thanks to COVID. All right. So the bottom, the x-axis, is again just market capitalization. And we're looking at every single company that had at least 2 patents. We were lazy, we didn't go for 1. Okay, so every company that had at least 2 patents. And what you can see from this is that there's some really well-established companies that are doing great work and have been for decades that aren't that large. And then you also see some very, very large companies in just a couple of areas. So Saudi Arabia, you can't tell that from this. The gray is the United States, the red is China, the blue is Europe, and the yellow is everybody else. So you have Saudi Arabia's Aramco, Hoffmann La Roche is Swiss. So you can see that both market capitalization and filing patents are strategic decisions. I'm not saying that just any company can have giant market capitalization or file a patent, but not everyone who can do that chooses to. You can see that Facebook and Apple here, they didn't choose to file a lot of patents, even though they're very, very innovative, because they have other ways to defend their IP, all right? So, and now with this slide, you can see how these numbers sum up. So over here, what we see is that the European, the EEA, the area affected by the GDPR, and China, they aren't that different by those 2 different measures, right? And then you see that the rest of the world combined, right, is actually bigger than China and the EEA combined, all right? And then America is bigger than all of the rest in this particular sector. This may be one of the last ones where the US is still dominating. All right. So now that we've talked a little bit about what's really going on with regulation, and that was a big question. Is there a Cold War? Does Europe have to back the United States or else China takes over? All right. So let's talk a little bit more about what is regulation. So not a lot of people know this, but I do actually also publish in theoretical biology, a little at least. And that includes some work on gene regulatory networks. So in nature, regulation is basically whatever it takes to perpetuate some version of an organism, right? You keep changing, cells or whatever, but it's still you. So perpetuating you into the future. So for example, breathing is regulating oxygen levels. In nature, there's 2 different kinds of regulation. There's up regulation and down regulation, and we understand that routinely, right? So that's actually also true of artificial intelligence. So with artificial intelligence, the vast majority of the regulation that's happening is up regulation. Countries all over the world are pumping huge investments into the digital economy. They're very concerned to see that every company and indeed other kinds of organizations can get all of the benefits that take advantage of all the different kinds of efficiencies that you get from using artificial intelligence. But for the rest of my talk here, I'm going to talk a little bit about down regulation, which can be about making sure that a product is actually safe. Okay? In fact, contrary to what some people say, artificial intelligence regulation can be pretty easy. We just have to be transparent about how we build the systems. Okay, so to motivate this thing about transparency, first I'm going to talk about some research I published back in 2017 with some colleagues. So first, to understand this, you need to understand what implicit bias is. So the women's names are easier for humans to pair with family words, and men's names are easier to pair with career words than doing it the other way around. Okay, and we can see this by how fast people can do a task about combining those words. All right? It turns out that using those same words, if we look up how they're represented in artificial intelligence that's been trained using machine learning on human language, we get the same kinds of results. We show that the mathematical distance between the words, that the females' names are closer to the family words, and the men's names are mathematically closer to the career words. Okay? So that was this finding, and it made headlines around the world. But we didn't only show that, right? People thought that what we'd showed was that AI was sexist and racist. But actually what we've showed is that artificial intelligence is an extension of our own culture, which I knew because I built it. But anyway, we've also shown, though, that implicit biases reflect our lived experience. Let me show you how we know that. It's because we took some of these evil, sexist, stereotyped word embeddings. So now here, this is in the y-axis on the left here. So these dots are the names of jobs from the US labor statistics. So one of those blue ones down there is sadly programmer. It's a great job. Be a programmer if you don't want to be a scientist. Okay, and one of those red dots up there is nurse. Okay, so that's what the sexist word embeddings expect. The bottom, the x-axis here, is the actual percentage of workers in the occupations who are women. And you see that's really well correlated. Okay? So our implicit reactions are not our ideals. They're our lived experience. We explicitly negotiate our ideals, right? We do that so we can pick better futures. That's what we do with our consciousness, not with our implicit learning. All right, so here's the problem again. This is actually Finnish, and you see that the word hein is actually either he or she in Finnish. In our paper, we did this with Turkish, but I just love this graphic from Vjoka. So you can see that hein gets translated into he or she depending on what words it's next to. So how can we regulate this? So let's say you're trying to make a translator. What I've just shown you is that if we do things right, if we use just ordinary machine learning, nothing broken about it, we're going to get these stereotyped outputs that reflect our lived experience. Okay? Now let's say that you can figure out what those should have been. Now this is not easy, but if you can figure out what fair means, then you can go ahead and do something to translate from one of these, from the stereotyped outputs to the predefined fair outputs. And you could either do that with some kind of explainable AI where someone's hacked something, right? Or you can use machine learning now. Again, just use a simple, transparent algorithm that we understand, that's well understood, and you've got these tests to see if you're finished. But the point is, the whole thing is a translator, so you don't panic about one part of it replicating stereotypes. All right. Yeah, every stage should be auditable, and every stage should be replicable. So accountability for AI is possible, but it requires reliable enforcement governance. So can we trust governments? No. Governments are exactly like AI. In fact, some people think that they are a form of AI because we build them. Therefore, we have to actively make sure that governments work and governments are transparent. But governments are a principal means through which we organize to ensure that everyone does what's fair and just and sustainable. And sustainability is the only thing that can allow us to keep flourishing. So regulation, not just innovation, is actually our goal. We want to use science and power to keep humanity breathing. Thank you.
resilience is strength, resilience is the ability to adapt, the ability to change in your field for what is relevant and what is needed for you to do as a woman.
There is a lot of challenges that we face as scientists, and especially women in science. And I think resilience is the only weapon that we can use to go through this journey and this battle.
That resilience I have faced all my life, and I am happy to say that I overcome it most of the time.
Finding the mentors, finding people that will guide you and show you the ropes.
Not for 1 minute think that you do not belong to this field of science. We do.
We have seen in the COVID-19 epidemic how important trust in science is and how parts of the public can mistrust scientific data and new technologies. To discuss how to build trust in science and technology, please welcome on stage our next round table, including 2 laureates of the International L'Oréal UNESCO for Women in Science Awards.
Hello and welcome to this session discussing restoring trust in science and technology. Even as COVID-19 has made science an everyday topic across the world, it's also revealed how much mistrust in science there is and technology breakthroughs and the media that report on them. What are the driving forces of this mistrust and what needs to be done to restore public confidence? I'm Jeremy White, I'm Executive Editor at Wired UK, and I'm joined here by an extraordinary panel that we'll be asking questions of throughout the session. From my far right here, we have Shafi Goldwasser, co-founder and chief scientist at Duality Tech, director of the Simons Institute for the Theory of Computing at UC Berkeley. We've got Pauline Patterson, co-director of the Vaccine Confidence Project, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and then Raja Chekawi, professor of nuclear physics, Mohammed V University of Rabat, and member of Hassan II Academy of Science and Technology, and finally Denise here next to me, Denise Dresser, writer, political scientist, and professor, Department of Political Science, the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico. Welcome, all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. First question we have is, what are the drivers of contemporary public mistrust in science and technology? And so, Pauline, if I may start with you, what are the key public concerns around vaccination? How does trust or distrust play a particular role?
Thank you. Yes, for vaccination programs to be successful, it really does depend on trust, confidence, not just in the vaccine. So is the vaccine safe? Is it effective? But also trust in their healthcare providers. So does your doctor have your best interest at heart? Is your doctor competent? Or the healthcare provider at giving you that vaccine, but also trust in the process, trust in the policy. So is the policy based on evidence? Do people have trust in the policies that are there? And that's really key. And what we found is we conducted a study at the Health Protection Research Unit in immunization, exploring parents' views of whether they would accept a vaccine or not. 90% said they would. So in the UK, for example, people are willing to be vaccinated when asked. But the reasons why they weren't so keen to get vaccinated was this concern around safety, concerns around effectiveness, or possibly not feeling at risk as well. So we don't just look at confidence, trust, but we also look at convenience. Is it somewhere that's easy to get to? Is it far away? Is it at a time that you can go get vaccinated? If you're working during the day, can you go in the evening, at the weekends? And also in terms of cost, but also complacency. So do you feel at risk of the disease? And we have seen that some people don't feel at risk of the disease because it does affect more vulnerable people, more elderly people. So the young, we've seen, are less likely to want to get vaccinated because they don't feel at risk.
How do you go about not alienating people, when encouraging people to get the vaccination, the jabs, but without alienating them? You're talking about making it convenient, but how do you, the people that don't want to have them, for example?
It's really important not to stigmatize those that aren't vaccinating, and it's really important to not say that they're not vaccinating because they're uneducated or they don't know enough, and we need to educate them. It's really important to figure out Why are they not vaccinating? Is the vaccine in a place where people can go? Is it convenient? Figuring out, talking to them, not just communicating out, but also engaging with people, figuring that out, and then addressing those issues.
It'd be interesting to see what has been the most successful efforts either of you have seen in fighting vaccine hesitancy.
Before I answer that specific question, I want to address some global trends that Russia is simply one more evidence of.
Right.
They have to do with declining trust worldwide, and this is measured by the recent Edelman poll on trust. Decline in trust in governments, decline in trust in the media, decline in trust in journalists, and I think this is fueled by two parallel phenomena. One has to do with the disillusionment with liberal democracy around the world because of inequality, because of the rise in poverty, because of failure to deliver. And you're seeing the rise of populists on the left and on the right that because of the particular way in which they govern, tend to provide a narrative whereby they have alternative facts. And people should trust in them as the embodiment of the people. And therefore, they tend to discredit data. And scientists are part of a data-driven group of society. So there's that political factor. And I think it also has to do with a second trend, which is the rise of social media as a way of conveying disinformation about vaccines, as a way of spreading conspiracy theories. And because of the distrust in traditional institutions, people are now getting their information via Twitter, via Facebook, and the hesitancy rises specifically from those sources of disinformation. Where are vaccines working well? Where is there more trust? In places where there's trust in government, where there's trust in science, where there's trust in institutions.
Raja, that actually leads me to ask you a question, really. Even leaving aside this polarization here, but do policymakers, the politicians, trust science and research in your experience? Is this seems to be key for whether we're actually imparting trust through to the general public if the policymakers and the lawmakers are brought on board. Is this your experience in your field?
Yes. I think trust is mandatory to build a scientific project. And I can give my example. I am working in fundamental physics. So when in 1996, as the head of a nuclear physics laboratory, I proposed to my minister that Morocco becomes a member of an international scientific collaboration. It's not easy for our country. So you have to give all arguments. You have to give also what benefits our country will have. And this is very, very important to have the confidence of our ministry. And when we have his agreement, after that, I can give some example. For example,
please
yes,
do.
I show that first we will have a young researcher, PhD student or post, in high-level scientific. It's very, very important for our country. We will have technical transfer in our country. We will have innovative training. So all that is very important. And after that, the concrete results and positive results establish confidence until today. And despite the change of government, and this is very, very important.
Speaking of widening out to other areas as well, Shafi, I wanted to bring you in to talk about AI applications, something that's in the news a great deal over the last few years, but we use more and more AI applications every day. And this is an area that you work in specifically. So do people trust or mistrust algorithms, or should they mistrust algorithms?
Yeah, so in fact, it's a very good question because as we know, in the last 5 years or so, there's more and more talk about machine learning and AI methods being used in every aspect of life. And some of it are things we don't even think about twice. So the fact that we reroute traffic because we know where traffic is going. That has to do with the fact that we have a lot of data about traffic, and we have smart algorithms who tell us how to drive faster and safer. Similarly, about energy rerouting, and obviously everybody knows about medicine, that we have a lot more data about illnesses, about causes from all over the world, and if we collaborate and bring this data together, we can also learn insights about better pharmaceuticals and so forth. So AI has been there. It's because we now have more data and more computing power, we are able to actually take advantage of this data and using these AI techniques. And obviously that's a good thing. So it would be very unfortunate if because of mistrust, these algorithms are not employed. So I think part of the mistrust, not even touching on your earlier question, the other panelists, is because everything's happened so quickly.
Yeah.
It's even with the vaccine. If you think about it, some of the things that the anti-vaxxers say make sense to all of us. It's so fast. This vaccine was developed so quickly, and we're supposed to take it. And who knows? The point is that we have no time, and that's why we're doing it. So with AI, there's all these techniques. They're incredibly powerful. Language translation. The things. We know that we're using this. There are things we can do today. There are illnesses we can cure because we have all this available, and there's an amazing thirst to use it because it's so powerful. However, because it's quick, regulation lags, and not only regulation, even technologically, and this is things that I work on, you do have to pay attention. Is it accurate? How do you verify accuracy? Is it transparent? Why is a machine learning algorithm making one decision versus another, for example, in things like bail? Is it robust? So in other words, are there sort of outlier cases where this thing is brittle and it will break and it will affect people? Is it fair? There's a lot of use of this term fairness. In other words, if you have a lot of data about people, but you don't have a lot of data about minorities, and now you've changed the whole medical treatment, it might affect these minorities badly. So scientists, so it's more science, it's not less science. More science will fix these problems, in my opinion, because you pay attention to it, you make definitions, you come up with methods. But so I guess my point is, it would be really too bad not to trust because we won't be able to take advantage of what we can. There are legitimate reasons why people are hesitant because of the speed of the science is moving. But in my opinion, the way to fight it is to have more science. And education, obviously, and explanation to people that it's not somebody's always trying to take advantage of them.
Right. Denise, let me bring you in here.
Yeah. I want to broaden this discussion because I think we're headed very quickly to a situation where you have incredible advances in technology, in AI, and then those raise all sorts of ethical issues. Absolutely. And issues about how does science intersect with democracy? Yes. Because those tools that scientists are, in your part of the world, very excited about at UC Berkeley, I'm beginning to see, as a comparativist, how those tools can be used by authoritarian governments and not for good purposes. I mean, you see the rise of AI for surveillance technology, and I think science it should not be only for the few. It needs to integrate policymakers, and there needs to be a debate about the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. Even now in COVID, for example, what did we see? That Twitter, Facebook, that were platforms for the dissemination of incredibly valuable information also became tools for the spread of disinformation. And only a year and 9 months into the pandemic has Twitter started to move against those that were providing information that led people to vaccine hesitancy. Only now are they starting to remove accounts that were virulent spreaders of disinformation, Fox News being among them, for example. So I think there's a responsibility for corporations, for platforms and for the scientific community to bring in the ethical dimension, and also for policymakers, because we see the weaponization of science, the weaponization of artificial intelligence. And I think that raises significant questions for the scientific community and for those of us who are in the defense and promotion of democracy worldwide.
How do we actually combat that then? If we're talking about this disconnect between the science itself and what it can actually do, and then how it's implemented, those are two separate things. It's like almost trying to attribute whether fire is good or evil or not. And so, when we're talking in those terms, how do we actually go beyond the point of just saying AI is evil or AI is used for evil, or just and being able to educate the public and saying it's not science that's the problem, it's how it is used or who is using it that is the problem. How do we change those attitudes if the public perception is always bound up with how the science is actually used rather than what the science is?
I think in terms of vaccines, if I can add, so we conducted a study looking at disinformation around vaccines, and we did see that if someone is exposed to misinformation around COVID vaccine, they're more likely to decline vaccination. So there is that, but also, although people go to the internet and they go to social media, they don't necessarily trust it. So we can't blame social media for the reasons that people aren't vaccinating. And we also conducted sentiment analysis to look at what people are discussing around the COVID pandemic, for example, and most of it is neutral or positive towards public health. So the media do occasionally have headlines that make you worry and fear that most of information online is not credible, and worry that people are going to try and change your mind about things. But it's a real small minority, that disinformation. But also with the internet, with social media, people that can group that couldn't group before, and you can find information that will reinforce your pre-existing views. So if you're worried about something, you'll find someone else who's worried about it, and actually you can fall down that rabbit hole of getting into worry and fear.
But I think you're being very specific to the UK. If you look at examples around the world, and I'm not even talking about developing countries, look at what's happening in the United States, where it's not only that people receive bad information from the media, they are receiving bad information from elected officials, from governors who are vaccine reluctant, who don't want vaccine mandates, who keep insisting that these are not times, after more than a year of the pandemic, these are not times for masks, obligatory masks in public schools, for example. I think that the issue of bad leadership, not paying attention to science, I think we have to take into account what's happening in many other countries of the world. And if those countries aren't vaccinated, we're not going to be safe. So worldwide, globally speaking.
So we haven't just been doing studies in the UK, we've been doing global studies, and we did do a 19-country study where we looked at trust in information from government, and those that trusted were more likely to vaccinate.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important that policies are based on evidence, because people will be more likely to trust them. But I agree that these will be amplifying factors of distrust if your government are making decisions that aren't based on science.
Like, do you think we really should be looking at, this idea of politicians, taking science and perverting it in some way? Do you think we should be going back to basics in a way, showing the public what is science, so they can make their own distinction?
I think with the COVID pandemic and the urgency to eradicate it, everyone has forgotten that science needs time. Takes time, and this is very important. Indeed, the scientific process is well known and requires several steps. First of all, you give a hypothesis, you propose a model, and after that, you have to confirm this hypothesis by an experiment or an observation, and finally, the publication of the results and review by peers. So large publics and decision makers has to be aware of the time needed to ensure the outcome of science. I think it's very, very important. And with this pandemic, all people has forgotten that.
The late Stephen Hawking wrote, shortly before his death, that as a scientist at Cambridge University, he had lived in quote, an extraordinarily privileged bubble. Should scientists, therefore, really, I think, have more of a responsibility in addressing the concerns of real world outside of academia? Denise?
No, absolutely. I'm an academic, but at the same time, I feel that my responsibility is to make very complex issues and academic jargon intelligible to the broader world so that people understand what's at stake. And I think these panels are useful. They would be more useful if we actually had politicians on them. Because, they are the ones making the decisions.
Yeah.
I mean, you are all incredible scientists, and I trust and value your work intrinsically. But there's a big gap between your world and the people who are making decisions on the basis of electoral political imperatives, keeping their party in power, winning an election, and they use science or abuse science or ignore science for their own purposes. I think it's important for the scientific community to know how to communicate to the broader public, to integrate their work or discuss it with policymakers, to develop the field of scientific journalism. For example, in the midst of the pandemic, the work that I found most useful was Ed Yong's incredible articles in The Atlantic explaining COVID to the broader world. He won a Pulitzer Prize for that. And I think in every country, you should really develop that field so that you can directly address the public and its concerns, oftentimes jumping over politicians who are distorting what you are doing and what you are saying.
Should scientists enter the political arena to stop this happening? Denise?
I want to take this opportunity to denounce something that is going on in my country, and I think is something that is happening elsewhere, which is the political persecution of scientists. Well, I think in those specific circumstances, science has to defend itself, and you need to forge an international community or coalition in defense of science, and for people to speak up and say, this is wrong. We have to build relationships across communities, scientists, academics, policymakers, media, journalists, etc., at a time when in some places, science is being applauded, and in others, it is being persecuted.
About public trust in science and does it matter, and what are the solutions that we can do? We've already touched on some of these solutions anyway. It was nice that this discussion is weaving between them all. But regarding media, which we've mentioned a couple of times here, and obviously I'm being a member of the media, it's interesting to me. Like, should we, I'm always interested in, should we dumb down science in order to make it more understandable, more accessible? And at what point does simplification of this communication vulgarize science too much or degrade it too much? Is there a trade-off somewhere? Would you rather more people understood?
I saw that in French, that you have a master only on scientific mediation. And this is very important. And also, science is going very quickly. So international collaboration for each item is very important. We have to exchange, to have a relation between, no, we haven't to talk about Africa, Europe, America. No, we have to talk about a project. And we call all the experts in the world. And to explain after it, we have to have the project, but also to prepare us to communicate with decision maker. It is an exercise. It's not easy to communicate to the large public, and the large public is also these decision makers. It's very important.
And I think you have to shift towards just better communication, broader communication, clearer communication, and resources, governmental resources devoted to that communication.
I agree, but just to say something, you were asking about should journalists vulgarize or whatever. I mean, it's the wrong term, but I think it's there's nothing low enough.
There's
So
no low bar.
No bar. So no, I'm joking, but I mean, you know, the mad scientist in going back to the future, wonderful character. It's good that there are these characters which are scientists and are sympathetic, which I guess the media can use, or cartoons of scientists. I think the more the better, because I think that scientists being viewed as friendly characters, even for children who are going to grow up to be the adults who either respect scientists or don't respect scientists, and that they're not, you know, nerds or people who are cannot communicate or are not sympathetic. Obviously, the media can have a big part in making scientists as characters, as a profession, more accessible, more desirable. I think actually media does a great job in documentary films now about science. There's a lot more understanding about phenomena, about climate, and that's a big service that media does.
What about, sorry, Pauline.
Yeah, I'd love to add, in the UK, we've got the UK Science Media Centre, and they say media will do the science better when science do the media better. So they bring together scientists and media, and it's a great network, great collaboration, because then if, as journalists, you will know, you're in a rush, you need to write your piece, you've only got 24 hours, I don't know how long you have. And the Science Media Centre help kind of bring in the scientists and help us write press releases as well. And I think it works really well. And I think it's really important so that media doesn't sensationalize or try and grab the attention by having incorrect facts as well. So I do often talk to journalists, and it helps to clarify what is happening. And because sometimes people, even other scientists in other fields, don't understand what's happening, so they need to talk to someone who does.
That's a very good point. Do you think the media should be more ready to follow that example and not try and go for a binary answer?
So it's a very interesting question you asked about the media, but that's your profession. So being binary, you know, or sensational, or being decisive, sounds like a good strategy, right? But it might not be the only strategy. So provoking thought is another strategy. So I assume that it appeals to me, and my guess is that it appeals to a lot more people than media believes. So in other words, even about something very technical, you know, that you have an algorithm that makes recommendations, and you want to make it accountable. And then there's a question, are the algorithms today accountable? Can you, like a doctor, if he does a malpractice, you can sue him. Can you sue an algorithm? And maybe yes, maybe not. How do we make algorithms accountable? So by bringing up these questions, but not as an accusation, algorithms are not accountable. Let's not use algorithms. No, that's not the end. It's an interesting question. How do you make an algorithm accountable? Can it be done? So if media was able to provoke thought, wouldn't it be wonderful? I don't think it's an impossible task, but the easier task, of course, is to provoke sensationalism.
And I want to agree with you, because I think media has also the responsibility of raising questions.
Yeah.
Food for thought.
Right.
You know, at the intersection of science, technology, ethics. What are we going to do, for example, about the ethics of artificial wombs that are going to be down the road in 5 years? Or who gets to go to Mars? Who gets to live on Mars? I mean, should it just be private corporations that establish colonies, or is this the responsibility of governments, and is some regulation required? Just to put out two questions there. But there are so many more. And I think the media should be posing those questions as hypotheses, as exploratory issues, as food for thought.
Absolutely. I'd like to end this session. We've covered a lot of ground here today. So I want to leave you with some sort of takeaway from our distinguished panel, actually. So I think the best thing I can do is basically to ask you, if you had to choose one thing, what's at the top of your list for restoring public confidence in science? We've covered many different factors, but if you can only choose one, and I'm going to keep you to one, and you can agree with each other. I'm not asking you to choose different ones, but Shafi, we'll start with you. So, like what's at the top of your list to fix?
I think that media.
The media.
is to make the medium be less about sensation and more about exploration.
Excellent. Pauline.
I had 5 in my list, but if I was to choose one, I would go with engagement. Engagement with the public. Listen, don't assume, discuss, listen, engage. Really key.
Wonderful. Raja.
I think scientific mediation.
Mediation.
To cultivate dialogue between large publics, decision makers, and scientists.
Wonderful. And lastly, Denise.
Making science intelligible, making it easy to understand, communicating better, and understanding that scientists do not work in isolation from politicians and from other members of society, and you do need further integration and collaboration and communication.
Wonderful. Thanks so much indeed. I'd like to thank our distinguished panel here. I'd like to thank the audience as well. Thank you for joining us in this session here on Restoring Trust in Science and Technology. Enjoy the rest of the sessions. Thanks again.
We are now coming to the end of the first edition of the For Women in Science Festival. I hope that, like me, you have been inspired by these fabulous women who are rocking the world of science. Let's hear once more from these women about what resilience means to them as women in science. Then I'll meet you again to conclude the festival with an interview between Audrey Azoulay, Director General of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organizations, and Jean-Paul Agon, Chairman of the Fondation L'Oréal.
Resilience is about being more like Avengers.
It is kind of a superpower. It's something that we need to fight all of the difficulties that we find in our way.
Women have so much power when they have the opportunity.
Resilience is to be able to do all what we can to pursue our dream.
Following your dream, following your passion.
Not pay attention to criticism.
Do not focus on what other people think about you, but what you think about yourself.
Our For Women in Science journey brings us back to those who graciously brought us together, UNESCO and the Fondation L'Oréal. I now have the pleasure to have with me Madame Audrey Azoulay, the Director General of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and also Monsieur Jean-Paul Agon, the President of the Fondation L'Oréal. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madame Azoulay, UNESCO celebrated its 75th anniversary recently, and science was one of the highlights. So it seems now for the first For Women in Science festival, science seems to be quite high on the political agenda, and it is also squarely in the public's eye. So how do you see the UNESCO contribution to science, and especially to women in science, which is called for by the 30 women scientists that are taking the stage today?
First, it's a pleasure to participate in this festival because the issues we are going to talk about and the issues raised by these women are structural, are fundamental. So here at UNESCO, you mentioned we've celebrated our 75th anniversary, and the science, the S in UNESCO, has always been at the core of the mandate. UNESCO was built and was imagined during the war, and with this idea that we needed science to build peace, we needed international cooperation in science, and also we needed to take more into account the social impact of science, and today I would say its ethical impact. And this has led to many initiatives of UNESCO in science during this history in terms of international cooperation on ocean science, on biodiversity, on major infrastructure like the CERN in Europe for nuclear research or the SESAMI in the Middle East, things like that. But what we see today, and you were right to mention that science is very high on the agenda, is that most of the challenges we face need scientific response to deal with them. It's the case for, of course, the climate disruption, the loss of biodiversity, also the ethical impact of big data, of technology in our world. And for all this, we need more investment in science. And our number shows that there is not enough investment in science. But not only do we need more investment in science, we need a more inclusive science, and we need more women participation in science. And here again, the numbers are very bad. Despite all our efforts, today, when you look at the number of the proportion of women among researchers, it's only a third, more or less. And this number is not increasing really, despite all our efforts. When you look at also the scientists, the professionals in the field of AI or of big data, it's around 20% only, 2022. And when you look at the composition of the academia, the scientific academia around the world, it's around 10%. So we have a real deficit of women in science, and we work here to try and to lift the barriers that still prevent women participation in science. We do it through education in the programs or to facilitate education for girls in STEM. And we do it for now, 23 years with L'Oréal in a fantastic program that promotes women in science by giving more visibility to exceptional female scientists, but also to support young researchers in their field across the globe. So we combine our strength, those of L'Oréal and those of UNESCO, our networks, to encourage women into scientific careers. And this is something I think which is very important, and that we do across all our activities to try and have this gender equality dimension in everything we do. In science, it's very much needed. It's also needed in our normative instrument in science. We are discussing now in UNESCO an open science recommendation. The gender dimension is very important. Also another one on the ethics of artificial intelligence. Here again, we have an issue on that. But this program with L'Oréal has been a success, and we hear it from many of our laureates, to encourage and also to give hope and to give young women this impetus to go into science.
Monsieur Argon, the For Women in Science Festival gives a much needed forum now for the women scientists. They can introduce their discoveries, they can talk about their researches, but they can also share their thoughts about biases and also about the systematic discrimination that takes place in science and that stands in the way of gender balance in science. For you personally, what are the key messages that you take away, and also how do you see what actions need to be taken in the future that are crucial?
Yeah, there are several key messages, you're right. Well, number one is that this festival shows that these women scientists are just extraordinary. What we have seen today is really extraordinary. The quality, the level, the ambition of these women scientists is fantastic. And it confirms what Mrs. Azoulay said about the importance of women in science. Women scientists can really change the world. And we used to say that the world needs science and science needs women, and this is more true than ever. So that's the number one thing. It illustrates the importance of this battle. Number two, it shows also, as you said, that women are still really underrepresented in science, and it is just not acceptable. Why would we sacrifice, or why would we do without women in science? Women have to be in science, and they can bring absolutely a lot. And as you said, there is still many barriers, glass ceilings that limit their careers and their developments. So that's I think very important. And in terms of what the critical action for the future can be, I think that number one, as Mrs. Azoulay said, we need to give more visibility to these women scientists, because we need to inspire the next generation. We need to make young girls attracted to science, young girls confident that they can be successful in a scientific career, and sometimes they are not. Sometimes they are afraid that it's not for them, that science is not for girls, so we have to encourage them. Number two, I think also that we have to unleash the potential of women scientists in new disciplines. You know, we have made progress thanks to the great program with UNESCO, the L'Oréal Foundation and UNESCO in the past 23 years. You know, we have had 122 laureates, we had 3,800 fellowships in 110 countries. So we made a lot of progress and developed the presence of women in science, but it has been mostly in some scientific disciplines like biomedicine, biology, all these sciences, but there is still a lot to be done in other disciplines like mathematics, physics, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, and all these disciplines are super crucial for the future. So we need to stimulate women in this field. And to finish with, a different idea is that we think that we should also enroll men scientists, because by definition we cannot revolutionize science, and we cannot make sure that women are more integrated in the scientific world if men are not helping. It's true in science like it is in any other part of the society. So we have a program called Men for Women in Science, where we really try to motivate men to accept and develop and promote the careers of women in science. So it's a great program. We are very happy and proud to have this program developed with UNESCO, and we are sure that we are really contributing to a better science for tomorrow.
I hope so. It sounds like it. Thank you so much, Monsieur Argon. Thank you, Madame Azoulay, for these motivating, also open words. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Yes, it is indeed up to us all to ensure a brighter future for women in science, because only if we reach gender balance in science can science fully respond to the ever-growing needs of people and the planet.